Tanny had been raised alongside several gorillas, and her connection with one of them was truly extraordinary. Yet, when she left, she assumed he would forget her entirely. She was advised not to see him again after many years, but just wait until you see how he reacted when he saw her. Tanny Aspen and her father, Damien, were eager to reunite with the animals they had once cherished so deeply. They sailed on a boat until they caught sight of the gorillas a short distance away from the shore. They were eager to get down and greet the gorillas, but they had been cautioned not to approach them too closely. These animals had been living in the wild for years and might not appreciate their presence, but Tanny didn't agree with that. In her heart, she hoped they would still have the same fond memories that she had with them. They were family, or were they? These gorillas had built families in the wild, families that had never been in captivity. Getting too close was risky, that was what everyone said, not that Tanny listened. As they went down the river, they saw heads popping up between the bushes. Gorillas were watching them closely. Tanny knew the gorilla she raised. Even if he had changed a lot, she recognized him immediately among the group. The boat stopped, and she jumped out, despite the warnings from her father and their guides. The gorilla got closer. Jalta was once a tiny baby she held in her arms. Now, he towered over her. He stood on his back legs and came straight toward Tanny. There was no way that anyone could stop the gorilla now. No one could get between them if something happened. Tanny was on her own. Jalta got closer, then suddenly he grabbed Tanny by the arm. Her father wanted to rush forward, but he knew that he could make matters much worse if he startled the gorilla. Was this the way it would end? Tanny had spent her life loving gorillas. Would one of them injure her now? She couldn't believe that her childhood best friend would ever hurt her, but it really looked like he was going to harm her. Was their friendship over? The odd bond between Tanny and Jalta had started as a consequence of her father Damien's mission to save animals, and to do that, he started the Aspen Foundation. They worked hard to rescue animals, gorillas especially, and return them to the wild. They also owned the Howlett Zoo in Canterbury. When animals couldn't be rehabilitated and returned to the wild, they were cared for in the zoo. It's fair to say that Tanny and her siblings experienced a truly magical childhood. They all spent their childhood in the zoo, forming close bonds with the animals. Tanny was just over a year old when Bims, the gorilla, arrived at the zoo for the first time. He was injured, and his family was killed by poachers. He needed to be cared for. Damien and his team took on this responsibility. Tanny and her siblings were always around the zoo, and soon they were around Bims too. It was like he was one of their playmates. As Tanny grew up, she often played inside the gorilla enclosure, making sure that Bims never felt alone. It was loads of fun having a gorilla as a playmate. They didn't know it was going to get even better. One day, when Damien picked Tanny up from school, he said that there was a big surprise waiting for her at home. The surprise was big indeed, in the form of a big baby gorilla. Jalta was an orphan that could not survive in the wild on his own. When his mother was killed, he was still tiny. He needed someone to care for him and feed him. He couldn't just be placed in an enclosure at the zoo. Gorillas are family animals, and they needed to give that type of family feeling to the little infant. He needed to be fed and loved, and now Tanny was old enough to help do that. She made sure the gorilla ate his fill and held him when he was scared. She helped raise him, but of course, her unusual baby brother was going to grow way quicker than any human sibling would have. It wasn't long before he couldn't live in their home anymore. A gorilla isn't exactly a house pet. It was time for Jalta to move to the zoo. They still didn't want him to be alone, and he wouldn't be. There was another gorilla, Bims, waiting to welcome Jalta to their enclosure. They needed to be careful, though. Bims was a lot bigger than Jalta, and if he didn't want to be friends, he could seriously injure the younger male. They allowed the two gorillas to see each other through a gate first. The two touched each other's faces and tried to play. Bims showed a surprising gentleness, and it wasn't long before the experts felt ready to allow the two to be together. Letting them meet couldn't have gone better. The two were instant friends. Both of them also still adored Taney, and it wasn't too long before she was allowed to play with them once again. They never felt jealous, and were incredibly affectionate toward the girl. However, it wouldn't be easy to convince the public that their friendship was safe. Taney was accustomed to entering the gorilla enclosure whenever she liked, and spending time with the apes was nothing unusual for her. So she didn't even consider altering this habit when a photography team came to the zoo for a visit. They probably believed that the world would love to see the special bond, but that was not how it played out. Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. Instead, the public was furious that Taney or any of the other children were allowed to interact with the gorillas without safety measures. The public's reaction was so negative that the zoo was given a warning. If they didn't implement safety measures, they would get closed down. Suddenly, Taney was not allowed to touch two of her best friends, Jalta and Bims. She could only see them through the glass of their enclosure. She was old enough to understand the order hadn't come from her father, but still too young to know that people were worried for her safety. The gorillas didn't understand this either. They wanted to play with their friend, and were sad when they were told they couldn't. The reaction was heartbreaking on both parts. Every day, Taney came over to the zoo straight from school. She sat down on the step next to the glass, and as soon as the two gorillas saw her, they rushed over, just to be stopped by the glass. Jalta would moan softly, and Taney would place her hand on the glass. Jalta put his hand on the same spot on his side of the glass. He desperately wanted to touch her. It was sad, but her safety wasn't the only reason why she had to start limiting her interactions with the gorillas. It was time to get them ready for life in the wild. They were old and strong enough to go back home. They needed to get used to just having each other and other gorillas around, so the humans started to limit all interactions with them. From that point on, as sweet as they were in the zoo, they would need to toughen up for a life in the wilderness. A few months later, they finished off the training that the gorillas would need to survive in the jungle. Damien and his colleagues had been training them from the moment they came to them. The whole purpose of the foundation was to save those animals and release them if possible, and that was what was going to happen now, regardless of how Taney felt. It took a few months, but finally they were ready to start their journey home to Gabon. They found a sanctuary where gorillas would be safe, but at the same time roam free. It would be the last time that the family saw them for a very long time. Taney got to hug Jalta and Bims both before they were given something to relax them on their journey. The gorillas were excited to get to her. They put their heads on hers and enjoyed the hug for as long as they were allowed to. There was a unique connection between the girl and the animals, a bond that would now be divided by continents. Taney observed as the gorillas were put into crates and loaded onto the truck. It was going to be the first step on their journey back to Africa. This was what they all worked for. They all wanted the gorillas to live free. Still, it was bittersweet for Taney. It felt like she was saying goodbye to family members she might never see again. Years went by, and Damien went over to Africa once to check on them. The great news was that they were doing incredibly well. The two gorillas that they helped to save and raise had joined a family group. They lived as they were meant to live. Seeing them in the wild, surrounded by other gorillas, made it all worth it, even the heartache of saying goodbye. They were home in Africa, but that did not mean that they were forgotten. In fact, Tanny thought of her old playmates often. It had been more than a decade since they returned to Africa, and by all accounts they had become completely wild gorillas. In that time, they got nervous around humans, and they didn't want to interact with people again. So, Tanny was told she should never try to meet them again. She also grew up and started working for the foundation, just like her father. She helped to rescue loads of animals. Then Damon had a health scare and everything changed. He started planning a trip to Africa as soon as he was healthy again, just to make sure he would be able to see his favorite place in the world once again. For the occasion, they would try to locate the gorillas as well. The trip to see Jalta and Bims and their family was a long one. It was not a journey that someone older could take. If he wanted to see the gorillas one last time, he'd better do it soon. That was the plan. But as soon as Tanny heard that he was going, she wanted to go too. She had to see how the two gorillas turned out. She had helped to raise Jalta, and she wanted to see how he was doing. She was excited, but surprisingly no one else was. They warned her not to go. It had been almost 20 years since she saw the gorillas. They were a lot bigger and completely different. It would just disappoint her to see them. They wouldn't know her, and it was going to ruin her memories of the apes. However, Tanny ignored what anyone else said. She was determined not to let her dad go alone. She wanted to witness it firsthand. Daman was the only one who understood. He agreed that she could go. It would give her peace to see them in their natural habitat. It didn't matter what happened beyond that. Soon, they were on their way. The first part of the journey was to fly to Gabon, but there were no roads or airports near the forest where the gorillas lived. To get there, they would have to travel by off-road vehicle until they reached a home base where they would stay for a few days. In this way, they could go in search of Jalta's family more than once if they didn't find them right away. But they couldn't just hike into that part of the forest. Instead, they would take a small boat and travel along the river. Before they headed out in the morning, the guides in charge of the sanctuary spoke to them. They looked strict when they told them they couldn't just approach the gorillas right away. The guides would watch them, and only when they had decided that the gorillas were calm could they get closer. Under no circumstances were they allowed to touch or interact with the gorillas. They might have known them in the past, but they were wild now. Jalta and Bims couldn't be trusted to be gentle, not anymore. They were shocked by what they saw the first day that they went searching. As the boat moved along the river, Tanny and Daman saw faces peeking out through the trees. The gorillas were watching them. They were just as curious about the intruders looking for them. Tani couldn't help but gasp. The two gorillas she once knew were watching them closely. They had changed a lot, but she recognized them at once. She could cry seeing Jalta and Bims this close. And when Jalta grabbed her with his powerful hands, she felt like bursting into sobs. But her tears would be of terror, not happiness. As her knees shook, threatening to buckle, she looked deep into those familiar eyes, and she was sure she saw recognition. Then Jalta put his head against hers, just like he'd done when they'd last said goodbye. She ran her hand over his head, like she once did when he was scared as a baby. He gently rubbed her arms and kept his head down against her. The gorilla was saying hello. Then Bims came closer too. Just like Jalta, he knew his old friend. They had all changed, yet somehow they recognized that the woman before them was the same little girl who had played with them long ago. Bims used one finger and gently stroked it down her face. Daman came closer too. This time, the apes jumped up, and they started to hold on to him and roll over him. For some reason, they understood that they could play with him, but they had to be more careful with Tani. Their family joined them eventually, staying at the edge of the group. Father and daughter got to see their natural habitat, but the two gorillas wanted to spend all their time with the humans who were their first family. The guides were shocked. They didn't think the gorillas would so quickly revert back to animals that loved humans. It was pretty clear that they missed them. They were happy to see Damon, but something about the way they interacted with Tani showed real love. The moment they had to go back to the boats, the gorillas moaned softly, worried that they were losing their best friend again. The sight was heartbreaking. The good thing was, they had spent another day with the gorillas. This time, as they said goodbye, Tani knew that it might be for good. There were no guarantees that she would be able to come back one day. The gorillas seemed to sense her pain. They were reluctant to let her leave. Bims kept hugging her and holding her. He didn't hold tight, still as gentle as ever, but he didn't want to let go. Tani was crying as she pulled his arms away. Then she stood in front of Jalta, her first baby. She loved these gorillas like family, but this one would always have a special place in her heart. He put his head down on her chest, and she kissed the top of his head. She softly told him that she loved him. Then she got on the boat. The gorillas watched them leave. Tani would forever be grateful that she hadn't listened to people who tried to stop her from going. It was an experience that she would not give up for anything. She loved the gorillas, and now she knew that they still cared about her too. It was a special bond that was proven to stay strong through years and distance. They were where they belonged, and Tani would do the same. Go home and save more animals. Did you enjoy this story? Would you ever try to meet a wild animal you knew as a child after many years apart? Do you think all animals remember their first family? Let us know in the comments below. If you like the story, please subscribe to this channel and leave a like. What a beautiful example of interspecies friendship. Thanks so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.